Let's travel back in time once again, long ago this time. This is a guitar made by C.F. Martin and Company before automobiles, or spandex, or indoor plumbing for most people. It's even before Martin started putting serial numbers on their instruments, so dating these can be a bit hit and miss. But I think, to the best of my ability to figure these things out, and I'm really not an expert, so you can sort of send those emails elsewhere, I think this is a size 2.5. And the style designation, you know, the number that comes afterwards, the 17, 18, 28, they were kind of in play during this era, but not nearly as strict as they would become later on in the 20th century. So this is likely a number 2.5, 17. But, to add more confusion, whereas later on you might hear 17 and immediately think of mahogany back and sides, in this period that simply meant that it had a black lacquered neck with an ice cream cone shaped heel and no binding on the back. So you could, and usually did, have a 17 made out of Brazilian rosewood, like this one. Not to say they wouldn't make you one out of mahogany, because they would, or even some other less familiar woods, because they were kind of into alternative tone woods in that era. Not being an expert, like I say, I should probably cite some sources here. The first is a fantastic website put together by Robert Corwin called vintagemartin.com. It's got beautiful photos, lots of information. I'll leave a link in the description. And the other is a book which I've enjoyed for many years now called Martin Guitars, an illustrated celebration of America's premier guitar maker by Jim Washburn and Richard Johnston. This is sort of following in the footsteps of Mike Longworth's seminal production from the 1970s, Martin Guitars, A History. He was the one who first really kind of codified all this information in a format that people could understand. So there are good resources available out there if you're looking to learn more. I do know that this is made between 1867 and 1898. I can tell this because the interior stamp on the back reinforcement strip here says C.F. Martin & Co., New York. Now, this guitar was not built in New York City. C.F., Christian Friedrich Martin, moved to Nazareth, Pennsylvania very early on, back in like 1838, just, 5 years after he formed the company. But his distributor was in New York City, and he just kept it on the stamp. Seemed to make sense. In 1867, he took on some partners and then added the & Co. to the interior stamp here. Interestingly, they kept the old stamp that they used to put on the back of the headstock, or in cases like this where the neck is painted below the heel. It just says C.F. Martin. There's no & Company. I don't know if that's just a hint of vanity or what. Let's have a look at some of the features. This guitar has had a life. It's been repaired at various points with varying degrees of sensitivity. So you've got the usual spruce top. It says rosewood binding. This rosette has several colors in the diagonal section in the center there. There's some green, some black, white, and what looks like it would have originally been red or a pinkish color, which has faded. This is a typical 19th century slot headstock, and it's been patched up over the years in various places. There's a spot here in the center, also on the back, where you can see that there was a hole that had previously been drilled all the way through. That's not that uncommon to find. People in the early 20th century really like to hang these things up on a peg, so you often find evidence of that. But there's other areas where the cheeks have cracked. These are not the original tuners, but they're pretty old, probably 1940s vintage. And I'm not sure if this will show up all that well on camera, but there is sort of a dividing line, the evidence that the headstock was oversprayed, a difference in black between the new stuff and the original paint on the neck, right here behind the first fret. That might have been done in Montreal in the 1980s. The owner is in possession of a repair receipt from that time. It doesn't really detail what was done to it, but it came to $150 worth of labor and $6 worth of parts, which was not inconsiderable for the time. That could also account for some crack repairs on the top. These are interesting. I'm not sure how I feel about them, because they seem unnecessarily vicious in terms of the material removed. It looks like it was routed away using a 3/16" router bit, which is one way of making a clean, straight joint, but these days this would be frowned upon by most repair people. It's funny. I mean, if you did this in the 1970s, it would be, wow, boy, that guy did a real clean job. In the 1990s, it would be, you butcher. And now it's like, okay, these things happened. It's part of the history. But no, we don't remove original soundboard material if it can be helped. Yeah. Not the current standard. There are holes around the base here from a non-original tailpiece. This was often done in the first half of the 20th century to keep a guitar playable when the saddle became too low. They would slap on the tailpiece and just run the strings over the bridge without having to worry about clearance for the bridge pins. Or sometimes the bridge had fallen off, they'd just put on a lower floating bridge. It's not the worst thing that could happen, so I don't mind these. This bridge may or may not be the original. It's the right size and the right shape. I do know for a fact that these pearl dots here are an addition. And what do we suspect when we see pearl dots where there weren't any before? That's right, they disguise screws. This has been fixed in place just like a 1960s Gibson bridge with nuts and bolts. The owner is getting some buzzing around the upper part of the fingerboard, and that's not surprising because these are bar frets, and it looks to me like someone has tried to level them, but a couple are raised slightly high in their slots. Do you see a little gap there between the bottom of the fret and the slot? Here's a nice example of the ice cream cone heel. Again, the tendency is to see this and think this must be a very early guitar, because the design is associated with the Viennese style instruments that C.F. Martin learned from his time in the Stauffer workshop in Germany. But this goes right back to the Renaissance. It's quite attractive in its way. This miter cut here takes some know-how, because there's a long tenon attached to it that gets inserted into the neck shaft, so that it's a very secure joint. The woodworking in these things overall is it's superb. We're talking master level hand tool skills throughout. This guitar doesn't have it, but if you ever get a chance to look at a bird's mouth headstock joint from the 1850s Martins, the precise geometry in that, in the hand carving, it's really kind of astounding. Martin guitars didn't have serial numbers in this era. They didn't start that until 1898, although they did keep pretty good records of what they were building. But at that point, in 1898, they started with the number 8,000. So that's what they were estimating the company's production was over the 65 years of its history. That's only like 120-something guitars a year. Brazilian rosewood cracks. It just does. You don't have to do anything to it, and it will crack. Or you can do everything in your power to keep it from cracking, and it will still crack. A couple of open ones here in the back, a couple more on the sides. And there's a suspicious one here on the soundboard, which I think is open a little bit. This has been strung with nylon, and I'm happy to see that. Remember, in this era, we're not dealing with steel strings at all. If you're sitting on your velocipede under your beloved's window, it's a warm summer's evening, you're crooning to her, like, drink to me only with thine eyes, you're not playing a guitar that has steel strings. Don't even try it. It isn't until like the turn of the century that you start to see steel wound strings, especially for reinforced guitars like harp guitars with extended basses. You might get away with using silk and steel on a guitar like this, but even then I'd want you to tune it down a few steps when you're done playing. When it goes back in the case, it should be like C standard tuning. Okay? If you find one of these somewhere, you got to think of it as a classical guitar. That's essentially what it is. And on the inside, this looks like a classical guitar. This has got fan bracing. Hey, you're saying to yourself, Martin invented X bracing around 1850, so what gives? And that's true, but he experimented a lot. In the 1830s in New York, he apparently got a hold of some Spanish guitars, and he investigated that design fully. I mean, he replicated them. He made them with Spanish slipper heels and the whole bit. Changed the number of fans, he added cutoff bars, there are hybrid fan and X-brace mutants. And again, some of these ideas stuck around. He'd drag them out every once in a while when he wanted to play with them. Felt like doing something different. Okay, let's do some fan bracing. So he wasn't as rigid as, we expect the Martin Company to be, given its sort of slightly conservative nature. I'm hoping we can find a pencil date on the underside of this top, because that's pretty common. That'd be nice to know. In the interior, we see such things as those metal bolts holding the bridge in place. There's the heavily oxidized surface of the spruce soundboard, and in comparison, the lighter, new patch wood. The top linings in this one are solid and not curved. And yes, there is a pencil date. It's 789, so July 1889, those first heady months of Benjamin Harrison's presidency. There's an interesting loss of finish here along the edge that would possibly contact a player's shirt, but it stops in such an abrupt fashion, like it's a straight line, and the wood here feels just a little bit waxy. I'm wondering whether this was maybe buffed off at some point using a cotton wheel buffer. There is finish over top of the repairs in the soundboard, and it is sort of uniformly shiny with the rest of the finish, so I'm wondering if that's what happened. To reinforce this notion, on the lower edge of the fingerboard there's accumulation of red buffing rouge. Before we restring this, I'll probably want to do something about some of these screw holes. Some of them are stripped out and others are loose. If you've watched this channel for any length of time, you probably know how I deal with these cracks in the back here. I apply a lake of glue on the surface and then pump it through the crack into the interior using a suction cup here. It really helps the glue to penetrate all the way through. Cleanup's pretty easy with protein-based glue. Just comes off with some cold water. Then I use powerful rare earth magnets, both inside and out, to align the crack and keep it closed. Same thing for the top crack. Pump the glue through, clean off the excess. I'll also apply some gentle pressure with a clamp across the lower bout. I'll clean off some of the fretboard grunge here. Ooh. To reinforce the top cracks, I'll use some thin spruce cleats. These are about 50 thousandths thick, maybe 1.2 millimeters. To position them, I'll use magnets again with a little double-sided tape to hold the cleat in place. But first, it's very important to thoroughly clean the surface they'll be sticking to, because this is what's waiting in there. Try to glue to that, and it would fall right off again. Side cracks are a similar deal. Some of these areas have been previously repaired and lined with veneer supports on the inside. This spot needed extra support, so I'll use a little rosewood cleat. These are pretty old tuners, like I said, but they have Phillips screws, so it's possible they were kicking around in someone's shop for a good many years before they were thrust into service for this guitar. Because they're not like a slot head tuner at all. These are individual solid head tuning machines. It's possible the spacing here isn't what we would consider the modern standard. 35 millimeters between holes, 1 3/8. I'm not sure if the screw holes were pre-drilled last time, because there are long splits between all of the holes on both sides of the headstock. Can't leave it like that, so I'll pump a bunch of glue in there too and get those aligned and clamped back together. I'll drill out the old screw holes to a uniform diameter so that I can plug those using standard dowels. These are 1/8 inch dowels. Pare those off clean. Now I have a fresh surface on which I can install the tuners. I'll get those lined up well and mark the holes using an awl. Yes, I know the covering on my stool desperately needs attention. I'll get to it one of these days. I'll drill the pilot holes with a jeweler's drill. Don't go all the way through. It looks cheesy if you drill all the way through and come out the other side. The last guy did that. I can see his patchwork. Just checking out the fingerboard in the region of the buzzes. The entire guitar is a series of judgment calls. trying to make it play as well as possible while respecting its history here. These are more or less okay until you get up to the 11th fret here, which rocks a lot. And then again up at the 13th, which is the one that's obviously high and lifted from the slot. So I'm going to need to press these down some. Bar frets are tricky. There are no barbs that claw into the wood and hold them in place. So they really rely on friction against the slot walls to do that. Sometimes it's aided with some glue. It's not uncommon for people to pull them up a little bit to try and gain some height if they've been dressed low. But you have to put something under them if you do that. You know, they need to be supported on three sides. There are really only like 2 or 3 experts in working with bar frets in North America. The rest of us don't see them often enough to really gain a good working relationship with them. So really, the order of the day is care. Not to dress them off too low before ensuring that they're properly held in place. And you can go and level these, find out that they were loose in the slot, and that you've simply pressed them down with the file or the leveling beam while you've passed over them, and they'll pop right back up again. In the meantime, you've lost precious fret height that you'll never get back, because you don't want to replace these if you can at all help it. Looking at this fretboard in raking light, you can see that there are some serious scars and striations along some of these frets that are really quite deep, and I'm not exactly sure what they're from. Maybe the edge of a file from someone trying to recrown these at some point, or maybe they're sort of scooped out from someone using end nippers to try and pull up on these or something. It's a little bit strange. This 11th fret, I seem to be able to push right back into its slot. And that's staying in line, or more or less in line, with the others. That's much better. We'll see if that happens with the 13th. No such luck. You can see this fret isn't perfectly straight along its length. It's good for most of it, and then it kicks over a bit towards the end. So I'm going to have to somehow push this back this direction before trying to push down and get it into the slot again. I'm using plywood for this rather than steel or something, thinking it might be a bit more forgiving. I'll scrape down a piece of ebony to about the same width as the frets, about 50 thousandths wide. I'll use this to fill in any gaps along the ends. I'll carefully and judiciously plane this to a very, very shallow wedge on an inverted block plane here. Yes, I'm careful with my fingers. That will get installed with a little bit of glue in that empty space below the lifted fret. The question is sometimes asked by people who discover that they own one of these, how much are they worth? And that is a very difficult question. People are often disheartened by the answer, because the expectation is that old Martins are worth a lot of money. But you have to recognize that the models which are highly prized were made 40 or 50 years after this. Very few people want to use these to make music these days. You know, they're eggshell-like in their weight and their thicknesses, and very easily damaged because of that. The other thing is, for a guitar that should be strung with gut, or synthetic gut, or nylon, classical players, on the whole, aren't that fond of them either, because the neck profile on these is so incredibly triangular that it doesn't jive with modern classical technique. It's very uncomfortable for them, and the repertoire isn't really there either, so apart from some historical performance enthusiasts, these aren't played, and consequently they're worth less than a brand new Martin on the wall in the music store today. So they occupy this weird space in the collector's universe. They're worth less than hand-built European guitars of this period. Spanish guitars, definitely. And they're orders of magnitude less than Martins made in the 1930s and 40s. This is just the lightest of dressings in that bumpy area. Just going to make it as straight as it needs to be. These frets are so narrow and so rectangular in section that crowning them really just involves a quick pass to knock off the corners. Then I'll just abrade them with 600 grit sandpaper by hand and follow that with finer abrasives to polish them up. Just sort of rub sand them here with some 1200 grit. They're never going to feel like regular T-shaped frets when you're playing them. It's an interesting sensation playing on bar frets. Let's put some strings on and see what it sounds like.